Well, there I was, standing on top of the mountain, overlooking the valley below. Now, from the catacombs outside of Rome, where the dead had been buried for centuries, to the top of the mountainous town of Assisi, the view had changed drastically. But I was feeling the same thing. The summer between my 9th and 10th grade years of high school, I was 15 years old, and I was on a pilgrimage to Italy with my church youth group. It was the culmination of an intensive 2-year process of prayer and preparation and education, which then led to confirmation and a pilgrimage. It was a tradition at the church I grew up in. My brother had gone through the same program, and 2 years earlier went to Ireland. And here I was on a mountaintop, having a mountaintop experience of my own on pilgrimage in Italy. Now, I have to admit that day I had been glad to leave Rome, where we had been for the previous few days. I have plenty of friends who would disagree with me, but Rome was my least favorite place that I went to in Italy. It was crowded and dirty, and someone had pinched me in the Sistine Chapel. And in a lot of ways, it reminded me of Atlanta, where I grew up, and which I had gladly left behind for a couple of weeks to go on this trip. So whether or not I would feel the same way when I visited again as an older person, I was ready to move on back then when I was 15 years old. And as we left the city, we stopped at the catacombs outside of Rome, and we descended the steps to the tunnels, several stories underground, where the dead had been buried as early as the 2nd century. We walked into a room where they had set up communion for us. But we had no priest with us, and so we prayed evening prayer together instead. And as I was reading the gospel that evening, my eye was over and over again drawn to the bread and wine sitting there on the altar. Now, the next morning, as we stood in Assisi overlooking the valley below, it became so clear to me. I, in that moment, experienced God in a whole new way. It was in that moment that I knew God was calling me to be a priest. Just like that, as if it had been building since the catacombs the evening before, or for my whole life really, God was calling me, and I was changed. And that day began a new journey for me, a journey that would lead me to being right here where I am today. But then almost as quickly as it happened, we got back on the bus and we moved on to another town and another experience. And then a few days later, we got back on an airplane and we flew home back to Atlanta, back to the mundane preparation for school to start back again and to re-enter life as usual. But I had had a mountaintop experience. I had come face to face with God, and now everything was different. Shortly after Jesus foretold of his death and resurrection, he told his disciples, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it." Of course, it's clear and obvious that this would be hard for his disciples to hear. I'm sure they were wondering, what was Jesus talking about? What did he mean? And why did it have to be so hard? And then 6 days later, after dropping that gem on the disciples, he grabs Peter, James, and John, and he leads them up a mountain. And there, before their eyes, he is transfigured. And they hear the voice of God. "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." And because who wouldn't, they trembled with fear. But then almost as quickly as it happens, it is just Jesus and Peter and James and John again, and with a simple, comforting touch of a hand, Jesus says, "Let's go." It was already time to head back down the mountain and back to reality, back to the work that Jesus and his disciples needed to do. And though they were headed back to the same world that they had left, they were changed. They had come face to face with God, and now everything was different. For a moment, just a moment, James, Peter, and John got to see Jesus in such an extraordinary way. Face shining like the sun, clothes a dazzling white, standing next to Moses and Elijah and having a chat. They had the biggest mountaintop experience of them all. God had been revealed to them. And even though it terrified them for a moment, it strengthened their faith. And it gave them the strength to keep on doing the difficult work that they had been given to do. Now, years after my pilgrimage to Italy, after coming off of my own mountaintop experience in the many peaks and valleys of the 13 years that followed, I stood on a different mountain, on a completely different continent, the one where Jesus had lived his life and taught his lessons and died on a cross. This time I was 28. It was only a couple years ago, and I was standing at the top of Mount Tabor, where the Transfiguration is said to have occurred. And I tried to imagine that day with Jesus and his closest disciples. I tried to imagine what it would have been like. The clear skies and the quiet calm that might have preceded it. The laughter of four buddies hiking up a pretty tall mountain together. And then all of a sudden, this incredible life-altering moment. One of those moments where time slows down and you are taken aback by the transcendent experience you are encountering. One of those aha moments, a moment you wish you could stay in forever because of its sheer magnificence. And it did just that for Peter. It left him with this desperate desire to build dwellings for them on top of that mountain so that they could stay up there in the glory forever with God on the holy mountain and the glorious transfiguration. But as we know, he had to come down off the mountain, and he had to return back to the same life. But not before his faith was strengthened and he was transformed, just like Jesus was in that moment. That was the whole point, to be transformed by the love of God and then to go back and continue doing God's work here on earth. Even Jesus came down off that mountain, and he kept moving forward, even knowing what was to come more clearly than anyone else. Because as grueling as it can be to climb, as long as it might take to get there, and as glorious as it is once you do, we aren't meant to stay up there on the mountain forever. Our work, God's work, is back down at the bottom of the mountain, where God's people are. So once we finally get there, as much as we want to stay on the mountaintop, we can't. We just can't. Inevitably, we have to come back down because the world moves on and we have to move on with it. But we can do it walking the way of Jesus. These extraordinary experiences, these thin spaces where the curtain between God and us is thinner, where we feel so close to God and where we encounter the kingdom of God so clearly being revealed to us. They don't last forever, no matter how much we want to hold on to them. But these places and these moments shape us. They inspire us and refuel us, and they remind us of the redemption and glory that God gives us. And they prepare us to come back down the mountain, renewed and ready to keep going. And renewed and ready to come back to the normal life where we experience kind of mini mountaintop glimpses of God in our everyday lives. Seeking God in our lives and seeking God's guidance in our actions, we find what we need. Now, we know Peter was struggling a bit that day he went up to the mountain. He had recently questioned Jesus about his impending death, and Jesus had rebuked him. So I think he had to be struggling. I think he had to be a little confused and a little unsure and a little taken aback maybe. He was certainly shaken. But he was searching for answers. He wanted to have his faith renewed, so he followed Jesus up that mountain that day. And because he and James and John went up there with Jesus, they got to experience the transfiguration. And they were transfigured and transformed themselves. They got to see God a new way, revealed to them. Now, I truly had one of those experiences in Italy all those years back. Perhaps some of you have had a mountaintop experience like that as well. But I also experienced God yesterday in the joy on my rescue dog's face as she bounded unfettered up the hiking trail, stopping at all of the frozen dog poop that she could find to try to take it with her. This joy in that expression on her face was a place I saw God, right here in my backyard. Those little moments change us as well. They too can be moments where we meet God face to face, because we too get these glimpses of God. Sometimes on a mountaintop in Italy or in the Holy Land, and sometimes right here in our backyard along the Blue Ridge Mountains. And more often, I think God comes to us in these more ordinary and mundane places of life. The crying of a newborn baby, the holding the hand of a loved one as they die, listening to the stories of the past generations, or watching the sunset on an evening walk through our neighborhood. We don't always have to be on a mountaintop to be transformed. We can seek God out in the nooks and crannies of everyday life as well, because that's where we tend to find God. As we move through life, we get these moments, these glimpses, and even the seemingly little ones transform us, reminding us of God's place in our lives, preparing us to be God's hands on this earth. As we prepare to enter into Lent this week, as we begin to move through the events that led to the crucifixion of Jesus, remember that Peter struggled with this as well. Like many of Jesus' followers, and like Peter, we wonder and we question. We have some days that are just plain hard, and we have days where our faith becomes shaken. It's part of the human condition. So in those moments of weakness or of fear or uncertainty, or in times when you just need to be reminded of the unconditional love and grace that we receive from God, seek God out. Because it is in those moments that Jesus reaches out, and with a simple, comforting touch of a hand, he says, "Get up and do not be afraid." And then he leads us back down to solid footing, where we can continue to be God's hands on this earth. Amen.